I am delighted to be joined by Raj Rattan, a man who needs very little introduction. So, in quick summary, Raj has been in general dental practice. He has owned and operated a small group of practices combined with his part-time roles in dental education and dental legal work. He is now the dental director at Dental Protection, a role that started in 2016. Raj, it's great to be speaking to you again. It feels like a long time since we were chatting, but it was only at the end of last year. A lot has happened since then.
Indeed, Paul, indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to take part in these events.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we've got some questions this morning, basically around the hot topics of what's happening in the dental world and kind of jumping straight into it. Is there a feasible path to repair the current NHS system? On top of that, what do you think is driving the current trends in dentistry, whether that be majority NHS, majority private? Is it becoming more difficult in private dentistry? And how do you see that continuing?
It's interesting what you said about repairing the current system. In many ways, the repair element is part of a trilogy of things that need to happen. I think, if I can call those the three R's. So we talk about repair, as you've said. We talk about rescuing, I think, the NHS as well. And also we must talk a little bit about recovery. So I think the recovery of the NHS to a state where it can work well and people are happy with it, I think the recovery of the NHS is a function of the repair element and the rescue element. That's where the repair comes in, to use your word. So recovery might depend, for example, on the rate at which the repair process is taking place and the rescue process is taking place. And how quickly those are applied over time, I think is the real challenge, because the longer things go on, the greater the slippage and the more difficult recovery becomes. I think the priority now must be on timeliness more than anything else. In terms of repairing the system, I think the focus has to be on access to services. We need to address socioeconomic inequities, geographical disparities as well. I think these are our ethical obligations, and it's important that we should really do that. The challenge is that there are three perspectives on the NHS because there are three different stakeholders in the main. So we have a scenario where you have the patients, and understandably they want the best for the least. We have the dentists who want to provide the best, for a fair fee. So you could say they want the best for the most. And the government wants the most and the best for the least. Now, these three objectives are mutually exclusive. We can't deliver all three. So then what happens is we end up with a compromise. And what dentists then have to do is to think and consider that compromise and say, do I accept the compromise? If I do, I'll stay with the NHS. Or do I not accept the compromise and then leave the NHS? I think that's the real challenge here, Paul.
I think just now we have a lot of dentists sitting within the private camp and not necessarily delivering NHS or as much as they had done historically. But this is quite a kind of, well, probably quite a good compromise just now. We're seeing the demand still there for quality NHS. Do you think that pendulum will swing back again from private to NHS?
I think it will. I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the pace at which the repair is implemented. And the other big dilemma here is, you talk about high quality NHS services. The frustration for dentists is that they face a trilemma working in the NHS. They have to balance time, quality, and money. Time, how long it takes to carry out the treatment, quality, the standard or the effectiveness of the outcome, and the financial resources available to achieve that outcome. And the frustration is that a dentist who spends the time, who chooses to spend the time to deliver a standard of care which is of the highest quality, may find that the remuneration is inadequate. So that breaks down. Similarly, if somebody looks at the remuneration and says, this is what I'm being paid, this is how much time I can afford to spend, you then manage the time element and the money element, but you fail to deliver the quality. And then the quality declines. So to deliver all three, is very, very difficult. So I think there has to be a solution to addressing this particular trilemma.
Do you think under the current new government we'll see those changes?
I don't know too much about what is going to be planned by the government. We have some ideas. I know there's been some early engagement with the BDA, for example. There's also been an announcement, I think, in the last budget that the government is going to establish a time, albeit time limited office for value for money, a unit, an independent unit within the Treasury, um, with the purpose of scrutinizing public spending decisions. Now, given the challenges facing NHS dentistry, such as funding constraints, workforce shortages, accessibility issues, it's not implausible that the Office for the Value for Money may choose to evaluate dental services to ensure optimal use of public funds. Now, that is pure speculation on my part, but if that happens, then we might end up with a situation where actually the funding issues are addressed, but albeit in a way that we weren't expecting, i.e., through the Office for Value for Money.
How do you think digital dentistry is transforming the field just now? And what further innovations would you like to see?
If I can just reflect on a little bit of history for a moment, it's a long time ago now. I think it was in 1988. I was fortunate enough to be invited by Siemens at the time to attend the first international CEREC course in Switzerland. There were four of us from the UK who were invited to attend. And the invitation said, we're inviting you to glimpse the future. And so I, with my colleagues, went across for 3.5 days. And then we saw the earliest use of digital impressions and CAD/CAM. Came back to England. Siemens very kindly lent me the CEREC machine. It was CEREC 1, a very crude machine compared to today's technology. But I remember with great fondness being told that I had done the very first digital impression on a patient and the very first milled restoration on a patient in the UK. And that was an occlusal inlay on the lower left 5. That gentleman, I have to tell you, is still a patient. I still do a little bit of clinical work now and again, and that gentleman is still a patient. So that's the clinical application, the digital impressions, the digital tools to simulate aesthetic outcomes, for example, implant planning software. Is another example. I think in education, digital simulators such as virtual reality and augmented reality. These technologies will enable students to practice clinical skills in a very controlled, risk-free environment. I know that with some high fidelity simulators, students can learn procedures step by step, receive real-time feedback on the technique, and the software can capture the metrics on factors like preparation, accuracy, margin definition, and so forth. So that's another area, dental education. And then I guess patient interactions. Digital planning simulation software allows dentists to create detailed visualizations of treatment plans, enabling patients to see the expected outcomes beforehand. So I think these are the three areas, really, clinical applications, education applications, and patient interactions. They're all exciting innovations. It's important, though, that with all the technology, that we mustn't lose sight of the fact that patient behaviors are still the most important determinants of oral health. And, as I say, with all the technology around us, some basic truths still remain.
We're seeing a lot of news around the growing optimism around more access, uh, an increase in ORE exams and positions, and an influx or potential influx of overseas dentists coming into the UK. Do you see that as a viable option, and perhaps in one way being the biggest, most impactful part of contract reform, if we can link the two that way? And how do you see just generally the view of UK dentistry with overseas dentists delivering dentistry to our patient base?
I think I welcome it, Paul. And I share the optimism that's resulted as around workforce issues. Working under supervision is a big part of this, and in principle, my personal view is that this is a good sound initiative, provided that we have some quality assurance processes in place, and also I think it's very important that there should be very clear eligibility criteria for clinical supervisors. I think that's very important if we want to maintain standards. I think we can retain clinicians in the NHS, but we also need to address the root causes of why people leave the NHS. Yes, it is partly about money, but when I talk to dentists, and over the years, spoken to many dentists, some of them have made the decision to stay within the NHS, that have grown their businesses within the NHS. Others have left the NHS and gone into the private sector. Clearly, the money is an issue, the funding is an issue, and we can't get away from that. But there's another source of frustration for dentists, because we don't have clarification still about mixing NHS and private treatment. We don't have clarification around so-called top-up fees, and we're still waiting for that. And how can we apply, for example, clinical complexity indices to determine what is or is not available as part of the mandatory services element in the GDS contract, and what is classified as an advanced mandatory service. So these are grey areas, and people find this very frustrating, that they see them as risk zones. And if we want to preserve the relationship that dentists have with the NHS, I think we need clarity. So yes, by all means, let's look at the funding, but let's also simultaneously and in tandem address those grey areas, and make it very clear to dentists what is and what is not available under the NHS. That, I think, will do a lot to restore confidence in the system.
Raj, with such evident demand for NHS services right now, isn't this an opportune moment for the new government to adequately fund the sector?
I, like many in the profession, would welcome an increase in funding, because at the end of the day, money is the enabler. But there's another aspect to this, Paul, and perhaps I can just share a story with you. A couple of months ago, a friend phoned me up and said, I have a video cassette here. He said, I'm going to post it to you. He wouldn't tell me what was on the video cassette. So this video cassette arrives. I then rummage around in the loft, find an old video player, manage to rig it up, and I'm watching this video cassette. And it was a recording of a lecture that I did when I was a very part-time policy advisor at the Department of Health. And it was around the time when Options for Change was first published. That's more than 20 years ago. And as I'm watching this video, I noticed my first two slides in my presentation. So the images were identical. They showed an executive seated at his desk with a framed motivational poster behind him. In the first slide, the words on the poster read "more," and in the second slide, same image, the words on the poster read "different." Now, Nothing has changed. The same applies today. So yes, we need more money, but it needs to be spent differently. And I think that's the key for the NHS in the future. It's not just about the quantum in terms of finance, but it's also about how it's going to be spent differently. We took part in a pilot sites in back in 2010, 2011. And I remember at the time doing a lot of work around, what would the ideal system look like? And we were very optimistic that change would be around the corner. That in the end didn't happen, but that's another story. So what does different look like? Well, firstly, we need to rethink the metrics, the UDA. Funding discussions need to seriously consider the appropriateness of targets. I'm reminded of Goodhart's law. I think it's a reference I used in the printed interview I did with you some time ago. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So I think the first priority must be to rethink the metrics. Secondly, you need to improve the working conditions for dentists. There's too much stress because there's time pressure. Thirdly, we've already touched upon the importance of looking at access to make sure we deliver equitable care. We need to integrate oral health with the rest of healthcare. And then finally, we need to empower patients. We need to somehow promote oral health literacy, if you like, amongst our patients. Now, if you take these 4 or 5 things and bundle them together into the box labeled different, and we have a different set of metrics, a different way of measuring outcomes, using clinical care pathways, for example, which were piloted, I think, very successfully in the pilot sites. Others may feel differently, but I like that element. If we bundle all of these things together and then bring in the funding, we have a real opportunity here to make a difference. The other aspect of this, the funding, is we also need to ensure that there's adequate funding for the provision of specialist dental services for more complex treatments that are not available as part of the mandatory services contract under the GDS. Because at the moment, dentists report that when they have patients that need complex treatments, that they refer them to secondary care, and quite often the referrals are simply bounced back. So, if we want a system that works well, that meets the needs of patients, then we need the funding to work in a joined up way.
Raj, taking everything we've discussed today and with a little bit of optimism, what are you hoping to see over the next 12 months?
My hope is that we have, in no particular order, integration of AI and digital health records. My hope is that we improve the working conditions for dentists. We have fair remuneration. We have reduced administrative burdens if we are to retain dentists in the NHS and attract new ones. Above all, I hope that the contract reform agenda will advance, and there is at the very least a provisional implementation date for what will be the reformed contract.
Wonderful. I hope we see some of those aspects evolve as well, Raj. As always, your insight and views today have been warmly received, and thank you very much for taking the time to discuss with me.
It's always a pleasure, Paul. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.